No, the Nolecast thing is up here. We got to get rid of it. How do we get rid of it?
Wait, what Nolecast? I don't see it.
You don't see it?
No.
Okay, it showed up on my screen. I'll send you a screen recording of it. Anyways, if it's there, it's there. People are going to be confused. If not, I'm not doing it a third time, Zach. We're not re-recording a podcast that we just lost yesterday because Mercury's in retrograde and everything just went crazy.
This is Ingram Smith, and welcome to the Nolecast.
This is Bud Elliott. I'm going to get a softer keyboard now so you can't hear me type anymore. Hi, guys. How's it going? This is Brendan Sano with On the Bench. That's Zach Blostein. It's not Ingram Smith and Bud Elliott, but they just did a Nolecast. Was Ingram on it?
Yes, he was. He's back.
Free publicity for the Nolecast. There you go, guys. Check it out. Ingram made his triumphant return. So, yeah, I guess you can check that out. But this is On the Bench. It's another FSU football podcast, one of many in a totally not saturated market. And this is the second time we're recording this podcast because just StreamYard refused to work for pretty much everyone around the country yesterday and just gobbled an hour and 30-minute podcast that we did. And nothing's happened since we recorded yesterday morning anyways, right, Zach?
Not at all. It's been uneventful.
Boring. All right, so as we get into it, let's give a shout-out to our sponsors. First off, Chattanooga Whiskey. They are, one, killing it in the craft distillery game, but two, I didn't pull out the press release here because someone told me about this the other day.
Ooh.
So one, I heard that they have a single barrel rye coming out, which I love their standard rye whiskey. I'm not a big rye fan, but that rye is really, really good. And now it's going to be proof to I think it's 120 or just under it. So be on the lookout for that. But they have a really cool feature coming up here. Now it's only able to pick it up in their Chattanooga distillery. But if you're in the area, I highly recommend it. So they basically have announced the opening of their Vault series. So it's going to be some of their old school or more rare whiskeys that they have out there. So I'm pulling it up here. One is a smoked. Okay, let's find it. Oh my God, this sounds so good. So they have its original batch was made exclusively with cherrywood smoked malted barley, which sounds awesome. 4 single barrel experiments with multiple varieties of hardwood smoked malted barley, including mesquite, apple, and cherry wood smoked malts. That sounds awesome. I love smokier. I like peaty scotch and stuff. So the idea of blending that with the bourbon and getting the mesquite in there sounds like a lot of fun. So yeah, they just opened that up in their Vault series. So you can check that out, and you have to buy that at the distillery in Chattanooga. But if you're in the area, that's probably worth going and checking out. I think it's $45 or so for basically a half-size bottle. That type of whiskey is going to be so rare to get. Not a whole lot of people are experimenting in that sort of way. So Chattanooga Whiskey, check them out. And then after you drive up to Chattanooga, load up on a bunch of whiskey, drive back to Florida. If you're yeah, man, I want to sell my house and move to Chattanooga, full time. You know who can help you sell your house and get out of the state?
The Turner Group.
That's correct, Zach. By the way, are you wearing your Miami Hurricanes? Oh, okay, not a cane. All right. You have any Pop-Tarts for breakfast? What are you eating? Sorry, Colin. Back on track. The Turner Group can help you get where you want to go. Quite literally, Colin, Amy Turner, legitimately really great people who are very well, what's the word I'm looking for here, Zach? Sorry, Colin. Equipped.
I don't know.
Just cracked out this morning. They're well equipped to help you navigate the home buying process, and it can be rigorous. It can be daunting. It doesn't have to be, though, if you're in the right hands. And Colin and Amy work extremely hard. They are well connected through the state of Florida. It's also a smaller agency, and because of that, they're able to give you a lot of hands-on experience. We've had multiple people now have really good experiences with them. I know it's a big process, but if you're considering it and don't know where to go, that's where we'd send you. And if you're on the fence, if you don't know who to reach out to, message me, PM, DM, whatever, and I'll help you get in touch with Colin. So, all right, Zach, let's get into it here. 4 minutes of rambling as I just haven't talked about the big news, which is the transfer portals. No, I'm just kidding. Well, that was yesterday's podcast. Today's podcast is that Luke Kromenhoek has I guess he hasn't announced it, but he's endorsed it, and he plans to enter the transfer portal. It's reported by On3.
Yeah, he announced it because he hit up Hayes Fawcett from On3 to.
That's true. You assume it's him, right?
Yeah.
So On3 had it. Matt Zenitz for 24/7 Sports was able to confirm it. So basically, Florida State's former top 40 quarterback, borderline blue chip, or borderline 5-star, freshman quarterback, intends to enter the transfer portal. Now, as we record this on Wednesday morning at 7:45, he has not entered the transfer portal. And there could be a few reasons for that. The most logical is it can take 48 hours for one's name to show up in the transfer portal after submitting paperwork or putting in the request. I guess I don't know if it's actual paperwork, but putting in the request through compliance. And it's possible if it's a player that FSU wants to try to keep, they may go through that full 48 hours to go ahead and negotiate with them. I know there's been some speculation that it could be like a negotiation tactic. Maybe, I don't know that. I do know that, and that's going to be kind of the crux of what we talk about here, that finances have been at the center of the conversation. It's blown up a little bit on social media, which it tends to do this time of year. But I'm very, very confident in our reporting and our sourcing on this, and it's multiple sources, and it's not just FSU side of things either. So that's where I'll leave it there. And I'll throw this to you, Zach, as we can kind of start diving into what's happening. You're reporting on it, and then we can go from where FSU goes from here. But let's just dive into the Luke Kromenhoek announcement, I guess, that he intends to enter the transfer portal.
Yeah, I mean, obviously a huge deal because this was kind of the key piece to your 2024 recruiting class. The staff evaluated Luke Kromenhoek before anyone and offered him before anyone, landed a commitment from him very early on in his recruitment, fended off Penn State, Georgia during his recruiting process to hold on to him and sign him. So from a pure optics standpoint, and just from the amount of time that you invested into this kid, it is a big deal. And obviously the course of this season, it wasn't fair that Luke had to play as much as he did, but the reality was, I mean, you planned for him to be your future, and that's why you started him the last 2 games of the season. This is a big deal, and we'll get into our reaction to it, but just speaking more to how this went down, we from multiple sources have been told that FSU has been working to negotiate and try to retain Luke Kromenhoek heading into the 2025 season. There are a lot of variables at play, right? One being that he's going to be going into a new offensive system next year, or he would be going into a new offensive system next year under Gus Malzahn, the new offensive coordinator for Florida State. It is a different system in what is required from the quarterback position. So that is a variable that was at play here. And I think the transfer portal, FSU's plan to take a transfer quarterback, which, we'll get more into detail of that in a little bit. I think that also was in play. But I think from what we've heard, one of the main factors was an NIL, just negotiation and trying to come to a number that made sense for both sides. We were told that the number bordered around the 7-figure range. And I feel very confident in that reporting, that's, kind of where that negotiation led. And I just don't believe that Florida State was going to, agree on a number at that, high of a level for where the program is right now. And, they did value Luke a lot. They wanted to keep him on the roster. And I think that's pretty clear. Multiple coaching staff members, were in touch and in person with Luke and his family throughout the last few days and tried to make this work. But, a lot of factors at play. But like you said, the corner or the main part of this was the NIL portion, and the two sides could not come to an agreement on a number. And ultimately, Luke is planning to test the waters and go, explore the transfer market. I've heard some ACC teams, some SEC teams are already poking around on him. Not officially entered, but that's kind of how it works nowadays. Out with the days of caring about tampering, right? Like it's everyone's
Oh, we
just
just outright report now, like when someone intends to enter the transfer portal, schools they're hearing from already. Like
yeah. So
nationally.
they're already scheduling visits and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've talked
But
to a few kids in the yeah. I was
of
just
course,
saying,
FSU is the only school that got popped for like an NCAA
oh,
final, like a big one for.
yeah, and then it
Of
immediately
course.
the
Yeah.
rules changed like a month later.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've talked to a few kids that like it's funny how they describe it to me. Like I, obviously don't report it or anything or make them look bad, but like they'll be like, I think this school is going to have interest in me. I'm like, dude, I know they've talked to you. Like, this like that's kind of how it works now. But yeah, so interested to see kind of what his next step is. And I will say this, like in dealing with Luke over the years, great kid. Like I covered his recruitment from start to finish. And just wish him the best. And this is, I mean, objectively, I think like a loss for Florida State. I mean, this is someone they wanted to keep on their roster. And he's a guy that's he impacts other players on the roster because he was very well liked. That if you looked at the reaction to the news of him entering the portal yesterday, especially in that 2024 class, a lot of those guys were devastated about Luke leaving. I was told behind the scenes, some guys are emotional and thinking about leaving on their own right. I think some of that's calmed down since the news initially broke, but that will be something to monitor. The impact of Luke leaving on your ability to retain some of these other guys in the 2024 class that FSU wants to keep on the roster.
Yeah, Luke was a huge part of that 2024 class, which was FSU's best prep class, and it's a South Georgia heavy class. And he was a really good ambassador because he'd been committed for so long.
Yeah, he was driving the kids' commitment. Like, I mean, when I
Like
covered Charles
Lester's,
Lester's commitment ceremony, and Luke drove down from, I think it was like they drove overnight and I mean through the night, like to basically get to that commitment ceremony after a game or something like that, or so he had some kind of like thing that it was a crazy travel day for them. I remember talking to him and his family at that ceremony. So like, I mean, like I said, great kid. He was very well liked on the team, even for players not in his class. Like great relationship with multiple receivers. So this is big news and impactful news.
He was legitimately. We did a list of the most important underclassmen to retain. He was number one on it, and it's the reason why I said, and we've talked about it on the podcast. We did like the 10 things that we really want to see this offseason to consider it a successful offseason and give you confidence that FSU can move forward. And retaining a majority of that freshman class is part of that conversation. And Luke Kromenhoek was kind of in his own category, and we talked about it because you're going to have to do this delicate dance of probably bringing in a transfer quarterback and then trying to retain him. I think the moment, there's a lot at play here, but like the moment that you brought in a freshman quarterback in Kevin Sperry, which it's not a threat to playing time for Luke, but it is another person that you're bringing into the roster, and assuming that he'll be paid something, right? So you have, you're not bringing in a freshman quarterback for free. So to assume that, like Brock Glenn, you're probably retaining. That we've heard. So the moment that you probably retained Brock Glenn and then decided that you're going to add a transfer quarterback, it's just like this became this allocation. Like carrying four quarterbacks is not something that most schools do nowadays in the transfer portal era. I think a lot of schools don't do. And the idea of paying Luke Kromenhoek something comparable to a starter if you do bring in a transfer, which we'll talk about that soon. The name Thomas Castellanos keeps popping up. I think we talk about that pretty transparently at this point. But if you do bring in someone to start this season in Gus Malzahn's offense, and you're paying Luke Kromenhoek anywhere close to that, like it just creates this logjam of this idea of like, and this is where it goes big picture of FSU trying to operate in a $15 million salary cap budget. And I don't know what the price for all those guys. I don't know the full financials other than we've gotten details through multiple sources on Luke Kromenhoek's pricing. And it was willing to go down to 800,000, but the request was more than that and would have put it in seven figures. And like, I know that's been pushed back some by people and whatever. Like, I know our reporting is really ironclad and solid on that. And semantics regardless, because the difference between 800,000 and $1 million, like when you're talking about your backup quarterback, like it doesn't matter. FSU wasn't going to get to that point. So it was a number that was put out there that you were never going to probably agree to. which is whatever. They wanted, the Kromenhoek family wanted a tax for Luke having to be in an offense that he didn't like, and I don't know that for sure. That's just what I'm assuming, like where that pricing's coming from. But regardless, you're talking about a lot of money that you're pouring into one position. And FSU, we've been critical of this. It doesn't make sense to me when other schools are not abiding by this or not going to abide by this. If you're operating under a $15 million-ish cap and other people are probably going to be going way above that, you can't be spending millions of dollars at one position when only one guy plays at a time.
Yeah, I mean that's a larger point that we can get into, but that is something that is, I think we should talk about more and more is the fact that, you know, schools are not, like we've talked about this, like schools are not going to operate under the $15 million salary cap that's being proposed under the revenue sharing.
I had an agent yesterday start laughing when talking about that and said, God bless them for like thinking that's like going to be like, FSU is being laughed at now and outwardly for people not within the program because of that strategy.
Yeah,
and
it's wishful thinking. It is
far
too wishful, like for them to, for them to think that, like, when has college football ever been that way? When has anyone in college football, especially at these big time programs in the South, wanted to be on a level playing field? You think?
No, and I'm not trying to be judgmental to it. It's like it's a level of like naivete that's happening that like is going to hurt your program. It's going to hurt the on-field product. Like,
yeah,
because you just went through a season in which you were probably a top 10 team, top 15 team in terms of roster salary, and now if it's an even playing field and you're not willing to play ball and do things, around, skirting that. And so if you're now a top 30 roster salary or something, like what do you think the results are going to be?
Yeah, I mean, you're going to be on the same playing field as every other ACC team. Like that's, I mean, it's not going to help you, try to get players on your roster when you're 2-10.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean that we can get further into
that. We can talk about it another time, but I think that's part of the conversation here is you're having to make choices.
Oh, for
and
sure.
If someone is asking for an amount of money that prices you out of being able to field a holistic roster, then it's a non-starter, I guess. And I think that's where this was, and you couldn't justify paying what the Kromenhoeks wanted. And that might be reason, that might be fair market price for someone like he's ranked. What's he ranked in the transfer?
He's the number 2 ranked player in the portal.
Like he may go ahead and get that somewhere. And this isn't a judgment on that. Like it's just a situation that FSU's in. And the second they decide to go and have the quarterback room that they decide to retain and then bring in a transfer, you were doing this dance. And honestly, you were doing this dance even in the season, that we've written about that as well. And it's tough. This was a feather in Mike Norvell's cap to bring in Luke Kromenhoek. This is a guy that he talked about at his signing day press conference on last Wednesday, about like that's a guy that they evaluated. They offered first before anyone else. He turned into one of the best quarterback prospects in the country. Tons of tools, tons of upside. Was never supposed to play this year. Ended up having to start 2 games. Played a lot during the season. Some really bright moments and then a lot of low moments too, which was to be expected given the surrounding cast and whatnot. But the moment you decide to bring in, I think Gus Malzahn with that scheme and maybe wasn't tailored to Luke Kromenhoek's strengths, and then you decide to go into the transfer portal. This was always a reasonable outcome, I guess. So I'm not shocked by it. We had heard about it obviously for a few days, Zach, but my thoughts are all over the place on it. Like I don't blame the player for wanting to leave. It is a tough loss for Florida State from an optics perspective of quarterback development's just not really working under the staff outside of Jordan Travis, but anyone that you've brought in for the prep ranks just hasn't worked out at this point. Have been colossal failures, to be honest. Like how many guys have left the program and then had to leave another program because they just have had to keep going down? Chuck Purdy to Nebraska, then Nevada, and just entered the portal again. AJ Duffy just entered the portal a second time. Tate Rodemaker entered the portal first.
Yeah, I mean, I think every single high school player they've signed at the quarterback position, aside from Brock Glenn, has entered the portal, right?
God bless Brock Glenn. I will say, he legitimately willing to stay and compete regardless of what was happening. And I guess you could say what were his options. I believe he would have had options at the Power 4 level. if he decided to transfer, and he's going to stay and be probably your quarterback too this year. And honestly, might be a really nice scheme fit in Gus Malzahn's offense. So, what else do we have on the Kromenhoek stuff? Anything?
I think that's pretty much it. I mean, interested to see if any talks continue between the two sides today. But I think something to bring up, and something we saw Florida State, I think, not do a great job with last year was with players that threatened to enter the portal or plan to enter and use social media to do so. Florida State was very much willing last year, for a multitude of reasons, to continue to negotiate with those players and try to bring them back in the program. We saw that with several players on the defensive side of the football. I wonder, and just from what we've heard, I've heard that it's probably less likely that Florida State's going to do that this season. And I will say this, the caveat is obviously it's a case by case basis, right? Florida State, if a really talented player on their roster is trying to leave, they're going to do everything they can to try and keep them, especially if they're going to play a big role in what's going to be the most important season for Mike Norvell's tenure at Florida State, which is the 2025 year. So interested to see if anything continues between the two sides, or if Luke's name just officially goes in the portal today on Wednesday. But
can't happen again, Zach. I know it's case by case. It was a mistake last year the way it was handled. I think we were critical of it in real time, but also was willing to give a tip of the cap to the culture that FSU had cultivated, and obviously, haven't you heard from players who've said in hindsight that was disruptive? I know I've talked to people and players that have said that. Have you heard similarly?
Yeah, some players who played key roles in this not great season. I think the idea that you let guys who threatened to enter the portal multiple times, especially, come back and reward them with some of the highest paid salaries on the entire roster. I don't think that was well received amongst especially younger players on the roster, and also some of the guys that have been around the program for a while. I agree. It's not something you should do, especially, I think, the key part here is if it's taken, publicly, right? Which is something that we saw a number of players do last offseason. If you take it to that level, I think, it's cut bait season, and I don't think you should continue any negotiations. And, if you keep things behind closed doors and there's some back and forth, fine.
Yeah, of course.
But yeah, I mean, once it reaches the public eye, I mean, you just can't afford to make yourself look bad like the way you did last offseason, and kind of let these players leverage you publicly into bigger NIL deals.
Where are your butterflies?
They're in another part of the room.
They fly away?
They did. We said that on the first take too.
Yeah, well, no one heard that. It's gone. It's in the
I will say, guys, I proposed, so we had an entire 1 hour and 15-minute podcast, like we mentioned, that didn't record any.
I said 1 hour and 30 minutes, so the numbers keep changing.
And we should have done a voiceover and tried to match, one our voices on that pod. I'm sure that would have been a great product.
It would have been well received, and people wouldn't be talking about it years later like Falk in the Road.
Yeah.
Which I still maintain.
20 people unsubscribed that day from the site.
That's wild. That was so wild. People unsubscribed because of podcasts they didn't like. That wasn't even offensive. It wasn't like I went on some political rant or something like that. It was just it was a shitty podcast, and people unsubscribed from the actual website.
They were so disgusted.
What's wrong with some of you? What's wrong? Why would you do that? That's crazy. But I also talked about poop on a podcast for 20 minutes. Anyways, back on track. Florida State football is what people want to hear about here. The whole podcast we did yesterday was about the transfer portal opening up and going over different players who've entered, position groups, whatnot, targets, visits set up. We'll do that again. That's what this final probably 30 minutes of the podcast is going to be. It was a lot more in depth yesterday, but the Kromenhoek news, I think, changes the complexion of just what the news cycle is, obviously, but still worth talking about. So As we get into it, let's talk about like departures, Zach, real quick. There have been 12 scholarship players so far that have entered the portal. Luke Kromenhoek would make it, Baker's dozen. And some of that's fringe, like there's some borderline. It's difficult to say who a scholarship player is. Like a Marion Cooper, was he a scholarship guy or was he someone who was getting some? And I don't know. Anyways, a dozen-ish or so of the names who've left, and a lot of it's like guys who probably needed to leave, right? I think that's ultimately like a good thing that Mike Norvell has talked about is having real conversations, and players who have opportunities to play at a different level like need to go ahead and take that. And so we've seen some of that show up so far. There were a couple of FSU legacies who were 4-star recruits in high school, lower end 4-star recruits, but still 4-star recruits who entered that the fan base was disappointed with, and Julian Armella and Lamont Green, just guys who physically I don't think were frankly capable of helping out at playing winning football at this level, at least not in this program. It just didn't work out. So like, not surprised that either of those guys entered. The two names that really stand out to me, Zach, of like ones that are like, okay, they would have helped you out next year. Destin Hill and then Omar Graham. So wide receiver, linebacker. Let's talk about those two real quick.
Yeah, I think especially Destin Hill, just with the amount of time you invested in that wild recruitment, where you waited 2 years to even just get him on campus after he initially signed with Florida State, and a recruiting process that was the hardest to get information on I've ever seen or dealt with. And yeah, I mean, for him to go into the 2023 season as a true freshman and be listed as a starter against LSU in 2023 to, not really seeing a ton of burn due to injuries that were that he was dealing with that season, and then obviously an injury in the offseason that prevented him from playing at all in 2024. He would have been a starter for you most likely at receiver, and he definitely would have factored into the rotation in the 2025 season. So yeah, I mean, just all around an unfortunate situation for Florida State, who very much invested a ton of time and energy into getting him to campus, and he's a good player. Like he can help you when healthy. So yeah, unfortunate that to me that was the one. Like we had heard, like Destin was telling people around the program that he was planning to enter a few weeks, before the portal window opened. But sometimes we hear that, and that's just kind of like what guys are saying, and then when it gets to the actual time of negotiating and trying to FSU trying to retain players, usually I mean more often than not that gets squared away for a guy they want to keep. But obviously in this case it didn't. So yeah, I mean that's a tough one. And then Omar Graham, I mean he's another guy that's been with the program for a long time at this point, and someone that obviously has had his rough moments, but I think people will remember from this season, if you stuck around and watched the games towards the latter half of the year, like he got better. Like he was one of your more consistent players on defense, aside from that first game against Georgia Tech, and a guy that I think is very mature and was someone that I think a lot of linebackers in that room looked up to, just as far as like a leadership thing, and a guy that I think was a good culture dude to have on the team. So yeah, I mean he's another guy that I think would have helped you next year. Not saying that he's like this star that you can't afford to lose, but he's a capable player, and I think obviously there's some question as to where he'd fit in the new defensive scheme, and I think just talking to people around Omar, like it sounds like there was just uncertainty, right? Like the coaches that recruited him to Florida State, Randy Shannon, and he initially got recruited by Chris Marv. He's gone. Randy Shannon, the guy that coached him the last couple of years, he's gone. New DC. So like it's all new around him. So it makes sense that he'd be, wanting to explore a different situation. He's going to visit Nebraska this week, and he's got a visit to Kansas lined up as well. So it seems like he'll have some P4 options to turn to, which speaks to him being a pretty solid player for FSU.
And we'd been critical of his play, and I think it was deserved, at least like if we're just looking at the X's and O's standpoint of it. But he played hurt too, and he played hurt last year. He played hurt, honestly, that Georgia Tech game. He was injured and barely played practice that week too. and wasn't good earlier in the year, but like a lot of credit to him for persevering and legitimately getting better. Like I'm looking at his PFF stuff now from week 5 on, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 games in green coded for PFF, which is above average good. A couple more in yellow, which is average, and just one bad game against Notre Dame. But like he graded out 65.0, which is legitimately like replacement level star. Like he was a solid starter for you. And so kudos to him for getting better. Yeah, a guy you probably wanted to keep, but that does create something interesting at linebacker because it's just 3-3-5 front, right? Or 3-3-5 scheme, excuse me. So 3 linebackers generally what you're using. Now there might be a hybrid linebacker playing closer to line of scrimmage a lot of the time, but still, it's a position that's probably going to need an overhaul. But you lost to Marco Ward in the transfer portal as well. So just your amount of linebackers you have are getting thin. You have Blake Nicholson and Justin Cryer. We'll see if FSU can retain both of them. You're probably going to have to pony up for both of those guys to retain them and give them a bump. So we'll see. That's a position group that's going to be needed to be addressed again in the transfer portal because the recruiting hasn't been particularly good last few classes, which we'll document it on this show. All right. Transfer portal opened up on Monday. They're over now 2 days into this. More than 1,000 guys have entered, I think, at this point. And I know like our national team has like just been overwhelmed by the volume of it. And I think even coaches were surprised by the sheer amount. Like it's funny. Every year you talk about, it's going to be it's going to be wild. It's going to be crazy. And sometimes it pays off. Sometimes it doesn't. This year is actually wild and crazy. This is legitimately nuts. When you're going through the Twitter, this isn't a bit that we did the other day, by the way. It was the first time we're trying this out. When you're going through the Twitter, Zach, and you're trying to pay attention to like what Chris Hummer's putting in there, what our 24/7 account, or any transfer portal Twitter coverage person out there has put out there, like how do you go about for the people at home who want to know, how to decode who a good transfer is based on a tweet, so they can go ahead and like know how to spend their time looking someone up. This is a PSA I think that we'll provide for our users who just go to the message board as soon as they see a tweet and ask if this guy's good. This is going to be a good way to kind of for Ivan, who sends me a text like 10 times a day about a guy who enters the portal. This is going to be a good way to go ahead and figure out how to use your time efficiently here. Who's good? How do you know they're good based on a tweet?
I'm looking at one right now. So if the tweet says the only thing under them entering the portal is that they were a top 200 recruit, that means they have no production. So that's usually not a great sign, especially if they're a player that was a recruit in like the 2020 class.
Anything more than 2 classes old. If that's all you have, that's probably not great.
Yeah. So I've seen just scrolling through, our guys' Twitter, that was 2 guys that were just all that was mentioned was their ranking as a recruit. I think with sometimes you'll see like production, but it's like, oh, they did this in 2021. That probably means they haven't done much since. What are your qualifiers for?
So stats. I need to see stats, right? And when there's tiers to it. So when there's a lot of stats from this past season, and like I'm going to say a lot of stats like 800 receiving yards, 900 rushing yards, 60, 70 tackles, like for this season, like that's going to catch my eye and make me want to do more information, more digging, look for more information. When I start seeing career stats, that's a tier below, right? Because if you have to flesh through that. But it's like, 600 career receiving yards. Then you have to, how many seasons has it been played? And generally that's, you're diluting it a little bit. So that's one thing I look for. I think we've been a little liberal with the use of star. I think that's a little much. They can't all be stars. It's like porn stars. Like not everyone can be a porn star. I told you I wouldn't do that joke again today, but just because the camera's on doesn't mean you're a star. I'm sorry. It's just them's the rules. But just because we say someone's a star doesn't mean they're a star. And so that's been a little, I think they've gotten away from that in the last day or so. So, but if someone has an all conference tag to them, that's usually worth checking out a little bit more. Yeah, I think those are the main things to kind of look at is production, how that production is packaged. And if it's, a bunch of yards or a bunch of production in the last year, like go ahead and do some research on it. If it's just someone with a 4-star who was a 4-star recruit in 2022, and that's all that you're getting for information, hands off. Don't want them. Not good. So as we get into it here, let's go down just position by position. Wish Chris Nee were here to break it down with us position by position. I know how much he loves that, and talk about different names that are in the portal. I had a script printed out, or not printed out. It was if it was printed out, I'd still have it. I had it put together on my spreadsheet here, and now it's gone from because I deleted it after yesterday. And I can't get it back, and I'm not doing it again. So, anyways, quarterback. There's one name to know, I think, at this point. You have a crystal ball in for Thomas Castellanos to go to Florida State. Let's jump in. Who's Thomas Castellanos for the people who don't know, and why the crystal ball?
Yeah, it's the Boston College quarterback that's torched the FSU defense in back-to-back years, almost ruined the 2023 perfect regular season with a scary trip over there in Alumni Stadium over at Boston College in I think it was the red bandana game, I'm pretty sure. And he, that was kind of his coming out game, like at BC. He really went off against Florida State's, a defense that turned into probably one of the top 5 units in the country that season. Looked pedestrian that day, and obviously they were dealing with like illness and stuff. But yeah, I mean, he's the guy that is, really athletic but also has some intriguing arm talent as well. It's weird to look at the splits in the past 2 seasons with him, and I think it speaks to something in general. But yeah, I mean, in 2023 he had over 1,000 yards rushing, but Boston College had a head coaching change from Jeff Hafley to Bill O'Brien, who O'Brien seemingly wanted to turn Castellanos into more of a pocket passer, not someone that was freelancing as much as he was in 2023, which I don't think was a great fit, obviously, because that's not what he's going to excel at.
Yeah, his game's kind of predicated on running around, and he went from 1,000 rushing yards to 100. So
yeah, so exactly. So like you basically eliminated the best part of his game this past season, which I don't think was a great idea in the first place, but that's what they decided to do. So Castellanos, he got injured in a game, got benched, left the program a few days after getting benched by Bill O'Brien. And, there's 2 sides to that story, right? Like, I think, there's a little bit of there's an idea out there that Castellanos just quit on the team just because he got benched. I think there's more to that story. I can't speak to directly what happened because I wasn't there. But yeah, I would say that it's not as cut and dry as, hey, like this guy just quit on his team. But I do think that's important to note because, I think that's why some people have reservations about taking Castellanos at FSU. And I'm talking about more so the fan base and media. But with Florida State, it makes a ton of sense. And the main reason is because of Gus Malzahn, FSU's new OC. He hand recruited Thomas Castellanos to play quarterback for him at UCF. If you remember, Castellanos was a Florida State recruit as well. I mean, we all had crystal balls in for him at one point. I was looking back at old articles and, reading some stuff that Newberg and Wiltfong reported that, he was kind of expected to commit to Florida State as a running back. He said in those interviews, hey, like I prefer to play quarterback, and people that offer me a quarterback are going to have an upper hand in my recruitment. But if this is my best option, like this is where I'll go. UCF came in not late, but it was like in the spring after, he started to trend to Florida State, offered him at QB, landed him. He spent a season there, and it didn't seem like he was going to be the starter in his second year. So he decided to look for a spot where he felt like that would be the case, goes to BC, then obviously starts the past 2 seasons up there. So, yeah, I mean, he's visiting Florida State today on Wednesday. The visit should be starting. He's already in Tallahassee last night and should be starting this morning. That's where our friend Christopher Nee is camping out on the bench. And yeah, I mean, I think if everything checks out from Florida State side of things, as they evaluate Castellanos on the visit today, I could see him ending up in FSU's portal class in short manner.
All right, we could talk about it more if and when it happens, but it makes sense from a fit perspective. Whether I love the idea of Mike Norvell, I mean, really tying his future to Thomas Castellanos, it's a calculated risk, but these are every decision that you have from here after a 2-win season is kind of a calculated risk at this point. So I see the fit, I see the logic behind it. It makes sense for Gus Malzahn's offense. I don't know how many other like mobile, twitchy quarterbacks are in the market who'd be like markedly better. Like there's some other names like of mobile quarterbacks who you could like. But this makes as much sense as any, and he has familiarity with Gus Malzahn's offense and might allow you to get a head start in trying to make this a competent, run-based offense. And I think that's the play, and that seems to be the strategy. At running back, I'm not sure if there's anyone who makes a ton of sense for you right now. Like we know they offered CJ Campbell, which by the way, like he's getting like legit Power 4 offers at this point. I think Stanford, which is really cool. But I think that changed. Like I think your need for running back, you still might take a rotational guy, but anyone who wants to be like an RB1 type, like I think that changed with the addition of Usman Chroma. Would you agree with that, Zach?
Yeah, I don't think that's as much of a need anymore. I think they're expecting Chroma to contribute very early on in his career at Florida State. And you have a good stable of backs with versatile skill sets. I mean, I think they're always going, if they feel like they can make an upgrade at a position, they're always going to be on the lookout for that. But just with how crazy the market is for every position right now, I don't think that, that's a spot that you should be spending at in the portal. If you can find, a cheap option that makes sense, maybe. But yeah, from what I was told yesterday, I don't think that there's anyone in the portal right now that they're targeting at running back.
It's too bad. There's some really nice running backs in there too, who I am a big fan of. Like Mosley kid from Penn, and he's getting some Power 4. Like he's supposed to visit Syracuse and Georgia Tech. I think one other school, maybe Virginia. Like, yeah, that makes sense. He might be a lot of fun to watch in Georgia Tech system too, if that's where he ended up going. So, too bad FSU's not able to enter that market. But you got Chroma, and that could be a special player. So understood. Wide receiver is a position where they are going to be aggressive with, right? Like you have to be, given what the passing game was last offseason. And frankly, like I don't know if you got like a day one difference maker in this signing class. You got a lot of size. You'll see if someone like Gelsey or Scott or these like massive specimens you got are going to end up being day one contributors, but you're gonna have to enter the transfer portal. And I think it's been interesting to see the different types of guys they've gone after so far. Barry Brown is speedster from Kentucky who's kind of polarizing. His production has dipped each year, but he does have a lot of receiving yards in the SEC and is a dynamic kickoff returner. Might be one of the fastest players, if not the fastest player in the country, but probably really expensive. So we've seen them kind of expand the board at wide receiver transfers. They've offered Zach 2 Miami, Ohio transfers, which I didn't know that Miami, Ohio was like a wide receiver factory. But I guess let's talk about those guys real quick, because those might be slightly more attainable names.
Yeah, so Javon Tracy is one of them that got offered by Florida State. They both put up very similar production, but they're different players. Javon Tracy is closer to 6 foot, like around 200 pounds. 6 foot, 200 pounds, caught 57 receptions for 818 yards and 7 touchdowns in 2024. He's not as that bigger receiver type that they've kind of been in on recently, but has solid production. And I actually talked to him yesterday, and I guess Florida State expressed to him that they want to be his last visit, which I find a little bit interesting. But his other visits are to schools like Iowa State, Minnesota, Michigan State. So he's got like other trips set up over over this weekend. But I think if FSU wants to get in that recruitment, they probably can. And then the other one is Reggie Virgil, who's a 6'4", 190-pound wideout from Miami, or that went to Miami, Ohio, and had a really solid, breakout season this past year. 41 receptions, 816 yards, and 9 touchdowns, and averaged 20 yards a catch. the tie-in with him is that he's from Apopka, Florida, which is like in Central Florida, and he
APK. If you're from Apopka, you know, you're not from Apopka. You don't get it. You don't get it.
Anyway, I talked to him this week, and he hasn't said any visits the last time I checked, but he's getting really solid offers from he got offers from the big three in Florida. UCF's also in there, and a few other schools have offered as well, some SEC programs. So, I mean, he's a legit, commodity in the portal now. And the one thing I will say is when I talked to him, he did say that he grew up in a Seminole family. And I asked him, like, oh, did you root for FSU? He's like, yeah, we all did. So there's that, right? That might help you at least secure a visit from him. Sounds like he'll kind of see where everything's at and schedule some trips out over the next week. So we'll check in on that recruitment. But yeah, that's kind of the rundown on those two guys who put up solid production together at Miami, Ohio.
Were there any other wide receivers we need to focus on? I can't remember.
I'm trying to think of anyone off the top of my head.
This is a really good wide receiver. Like, there's been a lot of interesting names that have.
We expect them to have interest in like some of the top names. I don't know how realistic they are. Like Eric Singleton from Georgia Tech. Like,
it's probably gonna get priced out.
He's probably going to go for $1 million plus, I would assume.
Can't believe Georgia got a visit set up so fast after into the portal. That's crazy to me.
There's no tampering going on, Brendan.
And Georgia would never. Georgia would never tamper, and they would never allow anyone to tamper with one of their players. They're above it.
They don't snitch.
And it's because they're so busy going on 4 road games, every single season. It's so difficult in the SEC just to have to play 4 games away from home. So hard to do.
Come on, Greg Sankey. Barian Brown from Kentucky, the speedster. I don't know if we talked about him before, but yeah, he's
we did.
Yeah,
I spent like a minute on him. Thanks for listening.
Sorry, I was responding to an important text.
I'm trolling people on Twitter right now.
We got to focus. Lock in, Brendan.
You need to focus. So not talking about Barian Brown, correct?
Yeah, I don't. Sorry.
Travis Hunter has just decommitted. No, that was kind of
too soon. Still.
Too soon. Sorry.
Other receivers, CJ Daniels. Did you talk about him from LSU?
No, from LSU. He was tied to Kaden Salter, not Slater, with Liberty because they played together. So that's a guy. Yeah, he was mentioned. I don't know. It is a really good wide receiver. It's a really good group of wide receivers that all enter. There's a couple guys from West Coast who entered yesterday. There's just a bunch like Nazir Hunter, Omega Blake from Charlotte. Naziah Hunter was really productive at Cal despite them not having a great offense. He entered yesterday. Jay Michael Sturdivant is a good big wide receiver from UCLA. He's a Texas native and would be a good 9 wide receiver type. Oh no.
What?
I just saw your text.
I might as well say it. I think Taquan Underwood, the assistant.
We are talking about wide receivers. So
yes. The assistant wide receiver coach for the Patriots was in contention for the FSU receiver coach vacancy. And I believe he had an offer, but I don't expect him to take that offer. So on to the next.
So that would be, I guess we talked about this the last podcast that we didn't actually publish because the technology. FSU has probably gone through at least 3 wide receiver coach candidates who have either expressed not having interest or have said no. We know that Noah Pauley from Iowa State had an offer and said no. He had through the weekend to accept. It seems like Taquan Underwood was pretty quickly moved on to as another top target. We don't know if he was like the 3rd option or a list of other guys in the 3rd option, but that's now number 3. Marcus Davis from Auburn was someone who I don't know if I can say he was offered, but they did talk to him and he did decide to stay at Auburn. So the wide receiver coaching, it's been difficult to fill that so far. So you're gonna have to keep going down the ladder. And I think that happened somewhat at offensive line coach as well. You hired Herband, who who on paper, like that's a solid fit and someone who's worked really well with Gus Malzahn at multiple stops. And we'll talk about with some of the offers that you have out there in the transfer portal, like that's announced and he's on staff. But yeah, you could have had him, probably 10 days earlier if that was your number one target and would have made an impact with Solomon Thomas. I'm skeptical of that if Solomon Thomas would have signed if you had Herb Hand, but I've heard some people say that like he definitely would have considered it if you did have an offensive line coach in place. So he goes to LSU. So long story short, and we reported this at Knowles 24/7 over the weekend, is that FSU was having a hard time filling the offensive line job, and they had already kind of moved down the rung a little bit at wide receiver coach. Now you continue to. So as fast as the defensive staff got put together and as many home runs as you seem to have hit there, the offensive staff is a little bit more. It's a difficult sell given I think the offensive talent you have returning and production or lack of production. What's the
just unbelievable?
It's not though.
I mean,
it's not because it's not.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I maybe got my hopes up because of how the defensive hires went. It feels like they overachieved there, and it feels like they're maybe. It feels like they're underachieving though, right? Like it's not like in Daquan Underwood's case, like he's the assistant wide receivers coach for the Patriots, and it sounds like he's kind of been assured that he might take over that starting or that primary receiver coach role in next season or something like that, and that's kind of the reason why they wanted him to stay in New England. But yeah, I mean it's brutal because I think he would have been a really good hire, and whether or not he was the first choice, like we do believe FSU was working through, like you said, other options, but I think he would have been a sneaky good hire, especially on the recruiting trail. So yeah, I mean I think that's kind of upsetting. It sounds like that was the news delivered today, and just tough because I mean you're still without a receiver coach, and you do need help at that position in the portal, and that's something that's got to be filled pretty quickly.
I'm gonna guess. So next, who is the wide receiver coach? I should have had the name. Is it Kobe? He was at Auburn. Oh well, I shouldn't have gone down this road. He was on my list of the wide receiver.
Cody Burns.
Kobe Burns. That's it. Kobe Burns. I'm gonna guess that's probably next. You go down there. Yeah, that's just a projection. All right. Tight ends who have entered the transfer portal. So this is interesting because I think the Luke Kromenhoek news, him and Landon Thomas close, the South Georgia guys and freshman class, and I think the thought was you were in a good spot to retain Landon Thomas. And by the way, all your depth at tight end is kind of depleted in the transfer portal, which probably had to happen. But Jackson West, Jarrell Powers, Brian Courtney have all entered the portal. So if you retain Landon Thomas, then the idea of going and getting a big, bulky blocking type of tight end makes sense. But even if you don't retain him, this becomes an absolute must. Is getting a athletic H-back type of guy. You might even look at doing that just anyway, so you can roll with some two tight end sets and try Amari Williams at defensive end, or the jack position a little bit more. But a name that makes a lot of sense, and he has familiarity with Gus Malzahn's offense because he's played for it for the last couple of seasons. He knows as FSU campus well, and Mike Norvell well, because he was committed here at one point. I don't think it ended on bad terms. That's Randy Pittman. He just entered the transfer portal. He's been pretty productive. I think 300-plus receiving yards each of the last 2 seasons. Not a very big guy. He's like 6'2". He's athletic. That's someone who makes a lot of sense to me. So that's one name. And then the other one, who they went and they offered from Louisiana, that is Terrence Carter. He had 48 catches, 689 yards, 4 touchdowns last year. I'm clearly reading that. I didn't remember that off the top of my head because I keep calling him Kobe Burns, and my brain is going insane right now with the amount of work we've been doing and the amount of caffeine I've had to ingest to do it. So anyways, those are 2 names of guys who have entered the portal in the last day or so, Zach, who make sense from the receiving standpoint. Both are smaller, like undersized guys, but they make sense to the H-backs, and FSU's offered Carter, which makes sense. And I would imagine that Pittman soars the top of the priority list too.
Yeah, it's with the familiarity with Gus. I think that makes sense, and he's a guy that FSU is very familiar with him, obviously, from his high school recruitment. So it makes a lot of sense for FSU to go in that direction if and when he eventually does enter the portal, because I think it's been reported that he's expected to enter. So yeah, it's kind of you mentioned Cody Hardy. Sorry, I was reporting.
I have not. So he would fit in the mold. Go ahead and talk about him. He would fit in the mold of the blocking type.
Yeah. So something that FSU is looking for, like you said, in the portal is that kind of road grader type of tight end that they've kind of lacked throughout Norvell's tenure here. They've had guys that are capable at times, but it feels like that position has not been great at helping you in the running game. And I think with a guy that's kind of basically like a more athletic offensive tackle who has some receiving upside is kind of what they're looking for. Someone to mention is Cody Hardy. He was at Elon, the tight end, 6'5", 271 pounds. So he fits the mold of, like you said, that blocking type. He's got some visits set up over the next few days. He told me the FSU trip is probably going to be his last one. They have not offered him yet, technically, but he's someone that they've expressed interest in, and they've expressed that they want to get him to campus. Something I mentioned on the first take that I will reiterate here. There's unlimited official visits now for in recruiting and in the transfer portal. So I don't, when you're maybe fringe on a guy, whether you should take him or not, and you're just going off of your eval of his tape and just the surrounding information on the recruitment, I think getting them to campus, if you can manage it, it is a really, really helpful resource when you're trying to evaluate whether you should take someone. And obviously beforehand there was a cost to doing that with a limit on the amount of total official visits you could have in a cycle. But with that gone, with that rule change in place from the last few months, I think it's important for a guy like this, like who you're trying to make sure the measurables stack up to what's being reported, his height, weight, all the other stuff that goes into a physical, all the stuff that they go through on official visits. I think that's important when deciding whether you want to take someone. So I don't see the harm in trying to get a guy like that to campus to make sure that you want to go all in on him.
All right, let's go to offensive line. So Herb Hand, and it is Herb Hand, not Herb Hand. There was a debate in the group chat about that about a week ago, and you can guess who the ringleader of that was. But he's hired as your offensive line coach. I think on paper it makes sense. We had a whole segment dedicated to that yesterday. It feels like old news at this point. So let's keep moving along, Zach. Stuff's moving fast today. There have been multiple offers extended. And there's a couple guys with UCF ties, which that's where he just came from as UCF's offensive line coach with Gus Malzahn, who have been offered. And one of them that we know for sure has a visit set up, and that's Marcellus Marshall, who's a 2-year starter at guard at UCF, had previously been at Kent State, if I'm not mistaken. And then they went ahead and offered finally. And this is a guy that we like and makes a lot of sense. This is like a stability type of guy, but you're going to have to compete with some SEC schools for him. And that's Caden Kittler. He's a center, a little undersized, but like really good efficiency as a blocker. The film's solid, and he's reliable. And so that was just offered yesterday. And that was, I think one of the first like Herb Hand, like actual like transfer portal offers that we can document. So those are two guys up front. I'm just going to get on the list of offensive linemen that we kind of know about right now, Zach, that like there's a lot of interest in on FSU's end. Josh Braun from Arkansas might be a familiar name. He's a multi-year starter at guard there. He had actually visited FSU, I think, as a transfer a few years ago. At least
He transferred out of Florida, and he unofficially visited FSU back then for like a practice.
Okay. And he's from he's from Live Oak area, I think, if I'm not mistaken. His dad's a longtime high school coach and football family as well. And yeah, that's a name to know.
I think his older brother was coached by Herb Hand. I don't remember where. Someone told me.
Maybe at Texas?
Yeah, possibly. I don't remember where his older brother played, but Someone did tell me that recently, so there could be a connection to.
One of them was at Georgia Tech, if I'm not mistaken. There's three. There's this hilarious photo on Twitter of the three of the brothers sitting at a table, and they're just such massive human beings, and the table looks so small. It looked like a bunch of like, it looked like a bunch of adults sitting like at the kids' table, like on Thanksgiving, and it's just just genetics. And then another Arkansas offensive lineman who's worth mentioning is Patrick Kutas. He is another guy who's probably going to get strong SEC interest, but FSU likes him. He's versatile, can play multiple positions. He's dealt with some injuries in his career, but like decent PFF stuff there. And someone who they recruited out of high school. He's from the Memphis area, so there's ties there. So those are some names as interior offensive linemen. Derek Simmons is an FCS transfer, one of FSU's first offers in the transfer portal. He's from West Carolina. Picked up a lot of Power 4 interest so far. I think Pitt is one that makes sense because the coordinator ties there with Cade Bell, someone who coached him at WCU, but he's from Jacksonville. Initially, I think Jacksonville Beach. If Chrisney were here, you could tell us the exact like latitude, longitude of where he's from. But has an interesting film. It's a little up and down, but like he's held his own against Power 4 teams each of the last 2 seasons. And the guy that they're getting on campus, when Zach.
That is the 14th through 15th, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah. So that was one of the first reported visits that we had of a transfer taking a trip to Florida State. And he's a guy that has a pretty good market right now for teams that are after him. I think South Carolina and a few others. So yeah, he's a guy that I think obviously offensive line is always a position that's going to receive if you're capable, high interest in the portal, and Florida State's definitely in that market. So yeah.
It's interesting they've cast a wide net so far. I think that's encouraging. That's probably what you have to do. It makes sense. And then if we're talking about nets and trying to catch big game or something like that, like probably the biggest of game that you can go after in the transfer portal this cycle at offensive line is going to be Xavier Chaplin, multi-year starting left tackle at Virginia Tech. I think he's a redshirt sophomore right now, and he's graded out pretty well. I think he was in the 60s as a redshirt freshman, now in the high 70s as a second-year starter, and he's entered the transfer portal. Now, Virginia Tech size reported that VT's like not going to go out without a fight. South Carolina's interested. He's from South Carolina. I imagine they're going to be throwing money around in an all-in year with what they're returning. So, like, it will be an uphill climb, but he is a high priority that FSU absolutely loves. We've heard, though, the salary there might be like 1 to 1.5 million or something like that, which, taking this full circle, is like why you couldn't pay your QB2 800 to 1 point something million dollars, like whatever the final number would have been. You couldn't do it. Just not feasible. So if you're trying to be in that pool. So that's another name. Anything else to add to offensive line or that topic in specific, Zach? Sorry, I know I'm rambling. I'm trying to get through a bunch of names here.
No, I mean, I think you covered it pretty well. There are some other names of guys that have entered that I could see them going in on. Some guys from North Carolina, I think, some of their starting linemen.
I like their guard. He was a true freshman. I'm blanking on the name, but they had their left guard. I scouted him for
Did he enter?
I thought he did the first day. Their left tackle did, and he's okay. He's a veteran. He played at North Texas. He's a little stiff, but there's a kid from Vanderbilt they like as well. Gunnar
Hansen.
I was going to say Gunnar Holcomb. That's a quarterback. Gunnar Hansen, multi-year starter at left tackle. I mean, his PFF stuff's meh, but he's got thousands of snaps, and we know that FSU does value experience on the offensive line.
And he's from South Florida, from St. Thomas Aquinas.
Yeah, the overhaul has to be vast, and you're going to be throwing numbers at that problem, right? And seeing who materializes there, because you just have to. I did hear this is all subject to change because it's the world we're living in, but I think you're probably retaining Andre Otto and Lucas Simmons, which is nice. That's probably a good thing for development and having a chance to see what those guys turn into. So thumbs up there. It's some positive news. Defensive side of the ball, let's go through this pretty quickly because this is important, but we're going to be talking about these guys more later on. But the Nebraska transfers are the names that we'll focus on here, the guys who might be following Terrence Knighton and Tony White to Tallahassee. It's a really good group, and hence why you've gone after these coaches. Let's get into those defenders, Zach.
Yeah, the first two to note are two guys that I've confirmed have visits set to Florida State. They're both visiting at the same time, which is next Monday. Um, it's James Williams and Jamari Butler, both key contributors to Nebraska's D line this past season. I think Williams is like a higher upside pass rusher. Jamari Butler, I think, is a bigger framed defensive lineman who was also decently productive there, and both guys that I think are very fond of Terrence Knighton, FSU's new D line coach, and Tony White, FSU's new DC. So those two guys are definitely of note, and both. I think we there's a ton of predictions in for James Williams to Florida State, and I think that's because he's been on record a number of times about how much he loves Coach Knighton, and that connection just makes a ton of sense. And then the other two of note from Nebraska, I think right now are Prince Will. Say it, Brendan.
Uman.
Oh my! We literally had a practice take.
Yesterday didn't exist. It's
Uman Mielen.
Uman Mielen. What did I say? Uman.
I don't. You were trying to say Usman Kroma. Prince Will Uman Mielen. He is a kind of juiced up pass rusher. Who is actually, I think, the number one ranked player in the portal right now for 24/7 Sports, and a lot of that, is based off some projection, just because of his tape is good. He doesn't have a ton of production, and he wasn't. I got times he wasn't like starting for Nebraska this past season.
He has a lot of like quarterback pressures. He has 40 in the last 2 seasons, but not a lot of sacks.
So I think it's like 2 sacks or whatever, right? Like he doesn't have a ton of sack production, which is interesting. Like it's something that our guys have kind of noted, our rankings guys, like that they're surprised that he doesn't have more sacks with how much he pressures the quarterback. But yeah, he's a high value player in the portal. I mean, he's got a number of teams after him. I think Texas A&M, Ole Miss are two that have stood out early, and he's expected to visit both of those places this week. Was told that there's a chance he could join Williams and Butler on that visit to Florida State next Monday. But when I checked in earlier this week, it was not, or on Monday, it was not set at that time, but we'll see if, that changes here soon. And then the last guy to mention from Nebraska is Keona Davis. Mm-hmm. He was a true freshman this past season for Nebraska, but another big framed defensive lineman that Nebraska fans and that staff did not want to lose because he showed some promise in year one. This is a guy that Terrence Knighton was the primary recruiter on out of high school, out of Arizona, and Tony White was the secondary recruiter. So it makes a lot of sense why he'd explore his options and possibly give Florida State a shot. He's another guy that's rumored to be possibly visiting alongside Williams and Butler next week. We'll see, if that gets fully set up. Going to try to confirm that here soon. But yeah, he's a talented player. I think he only played like 90 snaps for Nebraska this season, but he did enough for Nebraska fans, just from reading the little litmus tests I do when guys enter the portal on these message boards is see the fan reaction. And, if they're wishing them good luck and, have a great career elsewhere, that's usually not a good sign. But I mean, they were calling this the biggest loss of them all, some of them. So yeah, I mean, he's a guy that, the staff now at Florida State, this defensive staff personally evaluated, recruited, landed, and developed for 1 year. So I could see a reunion happening there too.
Nebraska fans in general, pretty nice group.
Yeah, no, I mean they developed some really nice players, and I think what's impressive.
I don't care about the players.
What?
I said I'm talking about the fans are nice. I don't care about. The
players. Okay. I thought you were talking about these players. Yeah, I mean they seem like a nice fan base. They're kind of turning on Terrence Knighton now.
I mean, they can only take so much. Like this is after a certain point. Like,
but they might get Omar Graham,
and they got Phil Simpson too. So it's a fair trade.
Yeah, we'll take it.
It is what it is. No, that's a really good. Those guys you mentioned, like long, athletic, like that. There's a type that I think Tony White and Terrence Knighton have cultivated, and I think we're going to see. Like Nate Johnson at defensive end was offered. He's in App State. transfer who we really liked even last cycle when we were doing like our Tampa portal notes. And he got offered, but he's another like 6'5", 240-pound DN. So like that is a type for them. And yeah, I think that's going to lead to like a lot of fun football, especially in like pass rushing situations. So I'm excited about what the defense is cultivating. The offense, I won't lie, I'm very depressed with right now. The weather's kind of crappy outside in Tallahassee. And, I was excited for Taekwon Underwood. I thought that was like for your third option, like felt really good about that. And as I've let it simmer for the last 30 minutes, I'm now upset.
Yeah, with the offensive side of the football in general, like I don't know. Like it feels like obviously you have a new OC in there, but I felt like you needed some juice, especially on the recruiting trail. And I don't think that the hires you've made so far and the people that you've retained, like I don't see how that's going to be much of a difference. We'll see what they do at receiver coach. Like you said, I was excited for the idea of Taekwon Underwood. Like I thought that was going to be a really sneaky good hire, and someone that I've heard great things about just digging on, in South Florida and just in general.
And digging people. The comments are not going to be kind to me for this episode.
Good. You deserve it. But yeah, we'll see what direction they go, receiver coach. But I'm in the same boat. I feel like you overachieved with the hires you made on defense, but I feel right now, early judgment, that you kind of underachieved on offense. And I understand that it's not an attractive situation to have someone turn around that O-line room and that receiver room from this past season, which are, one was probably the worst in the country and the other's the worst in the ACC. It's a tough job, especially considering the circumstances around it where you're kind of on the hot seat heading into next season. So, yeah, I mean, I get it, but also it is Florida State, and the other side of the football, you showed that you could do something there by hiring some what we expect to be really solid assistants.
Mm-hmm.
And it just feels like not much has changed. And if anything, it feels a little bit, I don't want to, judge it too quickly, but I mean, we know what some of these guys are on the staff. And I feel like I'm underwhelmed so far, but I'll reserve my judgment for when my full judgment when the staff is completed and we get to see them in action a little bit.
When the dust settles.
Correct.
All right. This was a lot to go through. I know some shenanigans, but hopefully there was some information that was instructive and you guys learned some things as well. We've now recorded about an hour or 3 hours of podcast in the last 2 days. You only get to hear one of them. It is what it is. But yeah, hopefully this was instructive. I'm about to head out here and go down to FSU to help Chris out with any recruiting stuff. Thomas Castellanos is expected to be on campus shortly, probably by the time this podcast is up. And then we're going to get to talk to Gus Malzahn as well as Tony White for the first time. They have a press conference. So that'll be fun. We'll be, I'd like to say we'll do something later this week. I think it depends on kind of what happens with Kromenhoek and transfer stuff. But yeah, at minimum, we'll probably be doing something early next week to kind of do a primer of some of the visits and what's happening with like the Nebraska transfer. So we'll be back soon is what I'm trying to say. Anything else, Zach, before I get out of here?
No, I think we covered it all.
All right. Well, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Thanks to everyone who signed up at Knowles 24/7, those who've been here for a long time as well and have been cool customers to us. Appreciate everyone. We'll talk to you guys later. Hope this recorded.